Frank Doyle didn't knock. He never knocked. The door to Naomi Carter's small room above the laundry swung open so hard it cracked against the wall, and every woman in the building heard it. "Pack your things," he said, standing in the doorway with his hat still on, the way a man stands when he doesn't consider himself a guest. "You've got until Sunday to clear out of this building. I bought it this morning." Naomi didn't move from where she stood at the washboard, her hands still wet, her jaw tight. "You bought it," she repeated. "Every board and nail." Frank stepped inside without being invited, his boots loud on the bare floor. "And I'll be needing this room for storage unless—" He paused, the word sitting in his mouth like something he'd been saving. "You'd like to discuss a different arrangement." He said arrangement the way men like him always said it, like it was a favor, like she should be grateful. Naomi looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her washboard and went back to work. "Get out of my room, Mr. Doyle." He laughed, a short, ugly sound, and left. But he left the door open behind him. On purpose. That was Frank Doyle. He didn't need to break a woman. He just needed to leave her room cold and her future uncertain, and let the fear do the rest. If this story already has your heart beating a little faster, you're exactly where we want you. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what happens next, because this story is only getting started. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling us the city and country you're watching from. We want to see how far this story travels. Now settle in, because part 1 begins right now. Dustfall Ridge had a way of making people feel like they were already forgotten. It sat low in a valley between two ridgelines, the kind of geography that kept the wind screaming through in winter and the dust hanging thick and red all summer long. The town had been built fast and cheap, the way most frontier towns were. Lumber dragged in from wherever it could be found, buildings thrown up before anyone asked whether they'd last. Some of them didn't. The feed store on the north end had a roof that sagged in the middle like a tired man's shoulders. The hotel still had gaps between its planks that let in light and cold with equal indifference. Nobody fixed things in Dustfall Ridge unless they had to. That said something about the place. There were maybe 300 people living in and around the town, not counting the ranch hands who drifted in on weekends and left trouble behind. Most of the permanent residents had been there long enough to know each other's business without asking, which made privacy a thing you had to fight for, and gossip a thing that moved faster than any horse. Naomi Carter had been fighting for privacy for 3 years. She was 31, though most people who didn't know her well might have guessed a year or two older, not because she looked worn out, but because she carried herself like someone who had already decided not to be surprised by anything. She had dark hair she kept pinned back tight, brown eyes that didn't look away from things most people avoided, and hands that had gotten rougher than she'd expected when she was young. She worked mornings at the laundry, her own small operation out of the building on Mercer Street, and afternoons she took in alterations and mending for whoever needed it. She was not rich. She was not comfortable, but she was independent, and she'd learned in the last 3 years that independence was something you had to keep earning every single day because the world had a habit of trying to take it back. The laundry building was owned by a widow named Paulette Mercer, no relation to the general store, who had given Naomi a room upstairs and a discount on the use of the boiling kettles, in exchange for Naomi keeping the books and handling any customer complaints. It was a fair arrangement, and Paulette was a decent woman who asked few questions and offered no unsolicited opinions. In Dustfall Ridge, that made her remarkable. Frank Doyle had bought the building on a Thursday morning without telling Paulette he was interested in it. That was the first thing. He'd approached her husband's old attorney, found a debt nobody had talked about in years, and used it as leverage to push Paulette into a sale she hadn't planned to make. Paulette was 63 and tired, and didn't have the fight left to argue with a man who had already made up his mind. She took the money. It was fair money, she'd admit that much, and cried quietly in the back room while she signed the papers. Naomi found out the way she found out most things in this town. Too late to stop it, early enough to be angry. Marta Wills, who did the washing on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, came in that afternoon with her eyes big and her mouth already moving. "You hear about Paulette?" Naomi was sorting a pile of men's shirts. She didn't look up. "Hear what?" "Frank Doyle bought this building." Marta set her basket down heavily. Paid Paulette this morning. Papers are signed. Naomi's hands went still. When? Today. This morning. Clara from the land office told me. Naomi set the shirt in her hands down very carefully on the sorting table. She looked at the walls of the room she'd worked in for 2 years, at the ceiling with its water stain in the corner shaped vaguely like the state of Missouri, at the window that looked out over Mercer Street, where she could see the post office and the barber and the hitching rail in front of Doyle's feed operation. All right, she said. Marta blinked. All right? That's all you got? I said, all right, Marta. Not that it was fine. She went upstairs that evening and thought through her situation with the same systematic focus she gave to anything that required her full attention. Which wasn't easy, because her full attention was also, against her will, being pulled in another direction. Because 3 days ago, she had seen Silas Reed ride back into Dustfall Ridge. She hadn't spoken to him. She hadn't even let him see or notice. But she'd been standing outside the post office when his horse came down the main road, and she'd felt something move through her chest that she didn't have a clean word for. Not happiness, not exactly, and not anger either, though anger was in there somewhere, mixed in with everything else like a stone at the bottom of a clear stream. Silas Reed. She had not said his name out loud in a very long time, not because she'd forgotten it, because saying it required acknowledging that 3 years had passed since he'd ridden away, and that in 3 years she had not once received a single letter, a single word, a single sign that he'd thought about her even once. She had thought about him. That was the embarrassing truth she kept buried under the practical business of surviving. She had thought about him in the empty way you think about someone when you don't know yet whether to be sad or furious, and you've been waiting long enough that the two feelings have started to blur together into something that just feels like wait. The town had opinions about it, of course. The town always had opinions. She's still waiting on that Reed boy, she'd heard more than once, said in the tone reserved for people who don't know any better. 3 years, and she's still mooning. She wasn't mooning, she was working, but she'd stopped trying to explain the difference. The morning after Frank Doyle walked into her room and left the door open on his way out, Naomi was down at the washboards by 6 in the morning, her sleeves rolled up, working with the grim efficiency of someone who has decided not to think too much. Agnes Bowman, who helped with the heavy lifting 3 days a week, arrived at 6:30 and took one look at Naomi's face. You sleep? Some. He come back? He left the door open. Agnes muttered something under her breath that Naomi chose not to hear. Agnes was 57 and had buried a husband who'd worked for Frank Doyle for 11 years, which had given her opinions about the man that she did not bother to moderate. You know what he wants? Agnes said. I know. He's been saying for a year he wants to expand his operation down this end of Mercer Street. This building's right in the middle of it. I know that too. So what are you going to do? Naomi wrung out a shirt with both hands, hard, and hung it on the line. I'm going to find out how much time I have, who else he's pressuring, and what my options are. In that order. Agnes looked at her for a moment. You know, most women would have already cried twice and written a letter to their mother. Most women have mothers they can write to. Agnes went quiet. She knew that Naomi's mother had been gone for 6 years. She hadn't meant it as a wound, and Naomi knew that. She softened her voice a little. I'm not most women, Agnes. We both know that. Agnes picked up her end of the next load. No, you're not. But that doesn't mean you have to handle everything alone. Naomi didn't answer that because she wasn't sure she agreed. And she wasn't sure she disagreed either. It was the kind of thing that sounded true when someone said it and felt complicated when you actually tried to live by it. She found out about the timeline at noon when she walked to the land office herself and asked Clara, who was young and careful and technically obligated not to say much, but who also had a soft spot for Naomi, exactly what kind of terms had been written into the sale. 30 days for current tenants, Clara said, without looking directly at her. That's what Mr. Doyle agreed to put in. Is that standard? It's the minimum required by county terms. Clara adjusted the papers in front of her. He didn't have to offer more. No, Naomi said. He didn't. She walked back out into the afternoon heat and stood for a moment on the boardwalk, thinking. 30 days wasn't much. It was enough to find another space, maybe, if there was another space to be found. Dustfall Ridge wasn't overflowing with vacant rooms that a woman running a small laundry operation could afford. She'd need to talk to 2 or 3 people, lay out what she had, see what could be made to work. She was already running the numbers in her head when she heard someone say her name. She knew the voice before she turned around. She had spent 3 years training herself not to recognize it too quickly, which meant she recognized it immediately. Silas Reed was standing about 20 feet away, near the corner of the feed store. He looked. She made herself observe this the way she'd observe anything, without letting it mean too much. Older. Not old, but different. His face had more lines. His shoulders had the set of a man who'd been carrying something heavy for a while. He was holding his hat in his hands, which she didn't remember him ever doing before. He'd always been the type to keep his hat on. Naomi. She looked at him the way she looked at most things that required her to be careful. Even, steady, not giving anything away before she understood what she was dealing with. Silas? He came closer. He stopped when there was a reasonable distance between them, which she gave him credit for. I heard about Doyle buying the laundry building, he said. News travels. I wanted to say... He stopped. Started again. I don't know exactly what I wanted to say. I saw you come out of the land office, and I just... He stopped again. In 3 years, she had rehearsed this conversation approximately 400 times. Every version she'd imagined, he'd had something more articulate to say. Something that explained things. Something she could either forgive or hold on to as a reason not to. He just looked at her like a man who had gotten there and forgotten every word he'd prepared. What do you want, Silas? He let out a breath. To talk to you. If you'll let me. I have work to do. I know. I'm not asking for long, just... He rubbed the back of his neck with one hand, the hat still in the other. I owe you some kind of explanation. I know that. Some kind, she repeated. I know it's not much to offer. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she said, I'm going back to the laundry. If you want to say something useful, you can walk with me. He fell into step beside her, and neither of them spoke for the first half of the block. Then he said, I heard you've been doing well, the business. I built it without any help, she said. Not unkindly, just as a fact. I know. Another pause. I also heard Frank Doyle's been... Silas. She stopped walking. He stopped too and turned to look at her. She made herself hold his eyes, even though something in her chest was doing a thing she didn't appreciate. Don't start by talking about Frank Doyle. I can handle Frank Doyle. If you've got something to say to me, say that thing. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was lower. I should have come back sooner. Yes, I should have written. She felt something tighten in her throat and pressed it back down. You didn't write. I know I didn't. 3 years, Silas. Not one letter. He looked down at the hat in his hands. I know. And I'm not going to stand here and tell you the reason makes it right, because it doesn't. But there is a reason. And I'd like to explain it, if you'll hear it. She looked at him. In all the versions of this conversation she'd played out in her head, she'd been cooler than this. More certain. She'd known exactly what to say and exactly when to walk away. Standing here in front of the actual man, it was harder. Walk with me, she said finally, and talk. But if it sounds like an excuse, I'll tell you. Fair enough, he said. They walked. He talked. And Naomi listened in the careful, guarded way she had learned to listen to everything, with her heart set somewhere slightly back from the front of herself, where it could observe without getting hit. What Silas told her over the course of the next 20 minutes was this. After he'd ridden out 3 years ago, chasing work on the cattle routes north, he had written to her. 3 letters, the first within the month, the second at the 6-month mark, the third the following spring. He'd written them himself, which didn't come easily to him, and he'd sent them through the stage that ran the Eastern Loop, the one that passed through Dustfall Ridge on its circuit. He'd never heard back. He'd assumed she'd stopped wanting to. Naomi kept her face still while he said this. She kept her pace even. She did not let him see how the words were landing, because she had never received any of those letters. Not one. She knew this with the same certainty she knew her own name, because she had gone to the post office every single week for the first 18 months, asking Hob Greer at the window if there was anything for her. And there never was. She had eventually stopped asking, the way you eventually stop doing something that only hurts. She didn't say any of this while he was talking. She let him finish. When he did, she said, "Tell me about the stage driver." Silas frowned. "Which one?" "The one who carried your letters. The Eastern Loop. Who drove that route?" He thought for a moment. "Man named Teller. Court Teller. Why?" Naomi felt something cold and very precise settle in her chest. She knew that name. She knew it very well. Court Teller had been Frank Doyle's hired man before he'd taken the stage job. He'd driven Frank's supply wagons for 2 seasons. Everybody in Dustfall Ridge knew that. She didn't say this yet either. She filed it away, the way she filed anything that needed more thought before it could be used. "Nothing," she said. "I'm just trying to understand what happened." "I thought you'd chosen to ignore me," Silas said. There was something raw in the way he said it, something he'd been carrying a while. "I thought I'd waited long enough and you'd moved on, and I didn't have the right to push. And that was enough for you to just—" She paused, choosing her word. "Accept it?" "I was a coward," he said flatly. "I won't dress it up. I thought I knew what your silence meant, and it was easier to believe that than to ride back and find out I was wrong." She considered that for a moment. "At least you're honest about it," she said. "It's the least I owe you." They had reached the laundry building. She stopped at the door and turned to look at him again. "I'm not ready to have the full conversation yet," she said. "I need to think about some things. You understand that?" "I do." "Don't take that as anything other than what it is. I'm not running from it. I'm just not ready." He nodded. "I'll be here. I'm not going anywhere. Not this time." The way he said it, not as a promise meant to be impressive, but as a quiet statement from a man who had finally understood something, made it harder to dismiss than she would have liked. She went inside. She did not watch him walk away. She had trained herself not to do that. Agnes was still working, and she looked up when Naomi came in. "You were gone a while." "I ran into someone." Agnes waited. "Silas Reed." Agnes set down what she was holding. She looked at Naomi with the full weight of a woman who had known her for 2 years and watched her carry things she never talked about. "And?" Naomi picked up her apron and tied it. "And I need to find out something about Court Teller," she said. Agnes frowned. "The stage driver? What's he got to do with anything?" Naomi turned to the washboards. "Maybe nothing," she said. "Maybe everything. I need to know for certain before I decide what to do with it." She didn't say anything else. She went back to work. She put her hands in the water and she scrubbed. But her mind was somewhere else entirely. It was running back through 3 years of silence, and for the first time the silence wasn't just an empty space. It had a shape now. It had a name attached to it. And if she was right about what that name meant, then the person who had kept her waiting was not the man who just walked away down Mercer Street. She wrung the shirt in her hands hard enough that the water ran down her wrists and dripped on the floor. The shirt was clean. She did it again anyway. Outside, the afternoon wind picked up and sent a ribbon of red dust rolling down the main road, the kind that got into everything if you didn't close your windows. Naomi heard it hit the side of the building. She didn't go close the windows. There were other things that needed her attention first. 3 years was a long time to wait and not understand why. If the answer had been sitting in a name she'd known all along, if the explanation had been right here in this same small town the whole time, she was going to need a day or two to figure out what to do with that kind of anger. The slow, cold kind. The kind that didn't burn itself out in a night. The kind that could be useful, if she was careful with it. Agnes moved around her without asking questions, which was one of the reasons Naomi valued her above most people. Sometimes, the best thing another person could do was work beside you in silence. The sun slanted through the narrow west-facing window and stretched long across the floor. Somewhere down the street, a horse stamped, and a man shouted, the ordinary sounds of a town that didn't know half the things happening inside it. Naomi kept working until her hands ached. Then she kept working a little longer. She had a lot to figure out, and she had a habit of thinking better when her hands were occupied. She wasn't waiting anymore. She never really had been. Not in the way people said it, not with that hollow patience that comes from having nothing else to do. She'd been building. She'd been enduring. She'd been deciding every single day who she was going to be regardless of who showed up or didn't. But now something had shifted, and she could feel it. The question was no longer whether Silas Reed had come back. He had. The question was what had kept him away, and what had kept his letters from ever reaching her, and whether Frank Doyle's name, which seemed to wind its way through every problem in this town like a root that went too deep to see, was going to turn up at the bottom of this one too. She suspected it would. She was almost certain, in fact. She just needed to know how deep the root went before she started pulling on it. Because if you pulled wrong, the whole thing could snap, and then you'd never get it out. Naomi Carter had learned patience the hard way. She'd learned to use it like a tool rather than carry it like a burden. And right now, with the water cooling around her hands and the evening starting to settle over Dustfall Ridge, she was the most dangerous thing in this town. A woman who finally knew what question to ask. She found Hob Greer on a Friday morning, which was the best time to find him because Friday mornings were slow at the post office, and he hadn't yet had enough coffee to be defensive about things. Hob was 60, a thin man with a permanent squint from too many years reading addresses in bad light, and he had worked the Dustfall Ridge post window since before Naomi had arrived in town. He knew every piece of mail that came through his window. He was proud of that. It was, in fact, the thing he was most proud of. Naomi waited until the only other customer, old Pete Sully, picking up a seed catalog, had shuffled out the door. Then she stepped up to the window. "Morning, Hob." "Miss Carter." He reached below the counter out of habit to check her slot. "Nothing today, I'm afraid." "I know. I'm not here for mail." She put both hands on the counter and looked at him steadily. "I want to ask you something, and I'd appreciate a straight answer." He blinked. "Well, all right." 3 years ago, when Court Teller was driving the Eastern Loop. She watched his face carefully when she said the name. There was something, not guilt exactly, but a kind of careful neutrality that hadn't been there a second before. "Did any letters addressed to me ever come through on that route?" Hob was quiet for a moment too long. "I couldn't say for certain." "Hob," she kept her voice level, "I used to come in here every week for a year and a half asking if there was anything for me. You always said no. I'm asking you now whether the answer was the truth or whether it was the answer you'd been told to give." The squint got tighter. He looked past her at the empty room, then back at her. "I never held your mail," he said. "I want that on record." "All right. Oh, what happened on that route? That's between the stage company and its drivers. I don't have authority over what gets handed off before it reaches me." She felt the cold thing in her chest settle a little heavier. "So there were letters," she said. "That never made it to your window." He didn't confirm it. He didn't deny it. He picked up a stack of papers on his desk and began unnecessarily organizing them. "You might want to talk to Dale Putnam over at the stage office," he said to the papers. "He keeps route logs for all the drivers, past and present." "Thank you, Hob." She was already walking toward the door when he spoke again, quietly, without looking up. "Miss Carter, for what it's worth, I always thought you deserved better than the silence." She stopped with her hand on the doorframe, didn't turn around. "So did I," she said. And then she left. Dale Putnam was harder. He was a former military man who ran the stage office with the kind of rigid procedural respect that made him useful in some situations and immovable in others. He didn't like being questioned about his operation. He liked questions about former employees even less. Naomi sat across from him in the small, cluttered room that served as the stage office and explained what she was looking for without giving him more than she had to. She asked about Court Teller's route logs, whether letters had been logged as received and never delivered. Putnam crossed his arms and looked at her with the expression of a man calculating how much trouble it would cost him to answer. "You're asking me to go back through 3 years of logs for a personal matter," he said. "I'm asking whether the logs exist." "They exist." "And whether you'd be willing to let someone, an attorney, if that's what's needed, review the relevant entries." The mention of an attorney shifted something in his posture. Not much, but she caught it. "Who told you to come to me?" he said. Nobody told me anything. I followed the question where it led. He drummed 2 fingers on the desk once, twice. Then he said, I'll tell you this much. Teller was let go 8 months after he started on that route. There were discrepancies in his log. Items marked as undeliverable that the recipient said they never received notice of. Naomi kept her face still. What kind of items? Sealed correspondence mostly, personal letters. He looked at her with something she thought might be reluctant sympathy. I'm not in a position to tell you more than that without some kind of formal inquiry. But the logs exist. They exist. She stood up. Thank you, Mr. Putnam. Miss Carter. His voice stopped her at the door, the same as Hobbs had. These men with their parting words. Teller didn't act alone on most things. In my experience. For what that's worth. She looked at him over her shoulder. It's worth something, she said. Thank you. She walked out of the stage office and stood in the street for a moment in the noon heat. Her shadow fell straight down, almost no shadow at all, the sun directly overhead. She felt very precisely the shape of what she now knew and what she still needed to prove, the distance between the two and what it was going to take to cross it. She also felt, somewhere underneath all the clean logical thinking, something that she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. Something that had nothing to do with Frank Doyle or Court Teller or missing letters. She felt the small and inconvenient fact that when Silas Reed had stood on the boardwalk and said, I thought you'd chosen to ignore me, his voice had the sound of a man who had been hurting too. She pushed that aside. There was a sequence to things. You didn't let feelings run ahead of facts. She'd learned that the hard way once, and she didn't plan to learn it again. She went back to work. Silas found her that afternoon near the edge of the Birch property, where Naomi had taken an armload of finished mending to return to Clara Birch, who lived half a mile out on the western edge of town. He was on his horse, coming the other direction, and he pulled up when he saw her walking the road. Where are you headed? He asked. Back to town. Just finished a delivery. He swung down from the horse without asking if she wanted company, which she noted but chose not to comment on. He fell into step beside her, leading the horse. I've been thinking about what I told you, he said. About the letters. So have I. He looked at her sideways. Something in the way she said it made him pause. Did you find something out? He asked. She was quiet for a few steps. Then she said, I talked to the stage office. She watched him take that in, the way his jaw tightened slightly. And? Court Teller had logged discrepancies, missing deliveries. He was let go because of it. She glanced at him. The man running that office thinks he didn't act alone. Silas stopped walking. The horse kept going a step and then stopped too, patient and unbothered. What does that mean? He said. Not a question, the tone of a man who was already arriving at the answer and didn't like where he was landing. It means someone may have paid him to keep certain letters from arriving. She stopped and turned to face him. Does Frank Doyle know you, Silas? Did you have any history with him before you left? The change in his face was immediate and not small. What makes you ask that? Because Teller used to work for Doyle before the stage job. She held his eyes. So I need to know if there's a connection I'm missing. Silas was quiet for a moment. He looked down at the road. I didn't have history with him directly, he said, but I did have a dispute with one of his men, about 2 weeks before I left town. Over water rights on the property I was leasing out on the North Ridge. What kind of dispute? The kind where his man told me I'd be better off moving on. He paused. I didn't take it as a serious threat at the time. I thought it was just posturing. And you left a month later. I left because I'd already been planning to. The cattle work up north was real money, and He stopped, started again. I had reasons that had nothing to do with being run off, but maybe I made it easy for someone to make sure I didn't come back. She looked at him steadily. Or make sure I didn't know you were trying to. He held her gaze. There was something in his face she wasn't used to seeing on him. Not guilt, though there was some of that, but something rawer. The look of a man rearranging a story he'd been telling himself for 3 years and finding out the shape of it was wrong. Naomi, he said. Don't. She said it quietly, not unkindly. Not right now. I'm still working through what I know, what I can prove. I need to keep my head clear. I'm not trying to. I know you're not. But if you say something right now that I can't unhear, I won't be able to think straight, and I need to be able to think straight. She looked at him. You understand that? He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Yeah, he said. I understand. They walked the rest of the road back toward town in silence, the horses' hooves steady behind them. It wasn't a comfortable silence, but it was an honest one, and Naomi had long since decided she'd rather have honest than comfortable. When they reached the edge of Mercer Street, she stopped. I'm going to ask you something, she said, and I need you to answer it straight. All right. Why did you come back? Not the short version, the real one. He looked at the street in front of them. A wagon rolled past, the driver not paying them any attention. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, I came back because I couldn't make sense of it anymore. The silence. It didn't add up. You and me, what we had before I left, I kept it against the silence and the numbers didn't match, and I finally got tired of pretending they did. She nodded once, slowly, not forgiving anything, not yet, but receiving the answer for what it was. That's the honest version, she said. Yeah, it is. She left him there and went inside. She had supper to see to and a plan to start building. The plan, such as it was at that early stage, began with a woman named Opal Gentry. Opal was 72, sharp-tongued, and had lived in Dustfall Ridge since before the town had its current name. She had known Frank Doyle's father, which gave her a particular kind of perspective on the son that nobody else in town had. She also had a small house at the south end of Mercer Street that shared a property line with the building Frank Doyle was eyeing for his expansion, the old Hennessy warehouse that had been sitting empty for 2 seasons. Naomi had been doing Opal's mending for 18 months. She knew the woman well enough to be trusted, which in Opal's case was not a small thing. She went to see her the next morning, early, before the town was fully awake. Opal answered the door in her house shoes with a cup of coffee already in her hand. Naomi Carter, at sunrise. Either something's burning or something's wrong. Neither one exactly, Naomi said. I need to talk to you about Frank Doyle. Opal looked at her for a moment, then stepped back and opened the door wider. I was wondering when someone would, she said. They sat at Opal's small kitchen table, and Naomi laid out what she knew. The sale of the laundry building, the stage driver, the route logs, the connection to Doyle. She didn't include Silas by name, not yet. She kept it to the structural facts. Opal listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. When Naomi finished, the old woman sat for a long moment, turning her coffee cup in her hands. You know he's done this kind of thing before, Opal said finally. I suspected. His father was a hard man, but he was straight. Frank's got a different kind of hard, the kind that works around things instead of through them. She set down her cup. 2 years ago, there was a rancher named Clive Hooper. He had a piece of land on the east side that Frank wanted for water access. Clive wouldn't sell. 6 months later, Clive's wife got a letter from the county assessor saying their land had a back tax debt from 12 years prior. Clive couldn't prove it was wrong because half his records had been in a barn that burned down the winter before. Naomi went very still. What happened to Clive? He sold, took what Frank offered, and moved his family north. Opal's eyes were steady and not particularly warm. Nobody could prove the letter was false. Nobody looked too hard either. Because Frank has friends in useful places, Naomi said. He has people who owe him things in useful places. Same result, different flavor. Opal looked at her directly. What are you thinking about doing, girl? Naomi was quiet for a moment. I'm thinking about finding out how many people in this town have a story like Clive Hooper's, and whether any of them still have their paperwork. Opal raised an eyebrow. To what end? To the end of stopping him from doing it to the next person. She paused. And maybe the one after that. He's not going to stop on his own. Opal studied her for a long moment. The morning light came through the kitchen window and sat between them on the table. You know, if you start pulling on that thread, Opal said, he's going to push back harder than buying a laundry building. I know. And you've got 30 days before you're out of a room. I know that too. So why? Opal stopped, looked at her differently. It's not just about the room. It was never just about the room. Opal picked up her coffee cup again, looked into it. Then she said, "There's a woman named Ruth Alderman out on the Alderman Creek property. Her husband passed 2 years ago, and she's been holding on to their water rights by herself. Frank's been making offers she hasn't taken." She glanced up. "She might talk to you. And there's others? I can think of 3 or 4 who've had run-ins with him they might be willing to discuss if someone they trusted was doing the asking." Opal set down her cup with a small definitive sound. "I'm not promising anything. These are tired people, Naomi. They've had their fights and lost some of them. You'd be asking them to have another one." "I'd be asking them if they want to," Naomi said. "They can say no." Opal looked at her for another long moment. Then she pushed back her chair and stood up. "Let me find you Ruth Alderman's address," she said. Silas was waiting outside the laundry building when Naomi got back. This was becoming a pattern, which she wasn't sure how to feel about. He was sitting on the step, not lounging. He'd never been a lounger, but sitting upright with his hat on his knee, watching the street. When he saw her coming, he stood. "I talked to Putnam," he said. She stopped. "The stage office?" "I know you already talked to him. I wanted to hear it myself." He looked steadily at her. "He told me the same things he told you, and then I asked him directly whether there was any record of who filed the initial complaint that got Teller hired onto that route." Naomi felt the hairs on her forearm rise slightly. "And?" "The recommendation came through a county official, a man named Burris, who handles labor placements out of the Eastern office." He held her eyes. "Burris works closely with Frank Doyle. They've been business associates for at least 6 years. The pieces were lining up in a way that stopped being a coincidence somewhere around the second one." "He put Teller on that route," Naomi said slowly. "Looks like it. I can't prove the instruction was for your letters specifically, but it wasn't just my letters," she said. "Putnam told me there were multiple discrepancies, other recipients. Which means if Teller was being paid to intercept correspondence, it wasn't a targeted thing. It was a broader system." Silas's voice had the careful, controlled edge of a man working to keep his temper attached to something useful. He was running control over information going in and out of this town. She thought about Clive Hooper and the false tax letter. She thought about how easy it was to shape a situation if you controlled what people knew and didn't know. "He doesn't need to threaten people directly," she said. "He just has to make sure they never have the right information at the right time." "And that they feel alone," Silas said, "isolated." They looked at each other. She could see in his face that he'd made the connection that she'd made, the same one that sat in the chest like a weight with a specific and infuriating shape. "He kept you from knowing I was trying," Silas said. She didn't answer that. She looked away, down the street toward the far end of Mercer, where the laundry building sat, where she'd been working every morning since before most of this town was awake, building something that was hers from the ground up. "And he kept me from knowing why you weren't," she said. Finally. She heard Silas exhale long and slow. "Naomi, I said not yet." "I know, but—" "Silas." She turned back to him. Her voice was even. "I'm not running from this conversation. I just need to stay useful right now. I have 3 visits to make this week and a 30-day clock on my building. Can you do something about the second problem while I work on the first?" He blinked. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I need another space or time to find one. Do you know anyone in this town who'd be willing to let me use their property for a laundry operation temporarily? Not charity. Proper terms. I'll pay rent." He thought for a moment. "Bill Sutter has that big barn on the north end. His wife does washing already. She might be willing to share the space." "Would he talk to you?" "Bill and I go back. Yeah, I think so." "Then talk to him." She held his eyes. "I'm not asking you to fix this for me. I'm asking you to run a piece of it so I can run the other pieces. That's different." He looked at her with something that might have been the beginning of understanding what 3 years had made her into. "That's different," he agreed. Agnes, when Naomi told her the outlines of the plan that evening, sat across from her at the work table and was quiet for a while. "You're talking about going up against Frank Doyle directly," she said. "Indirectly first, building a case, talking to people." "You know what happened to people who talked about Frank Doyle?" "I know some of them. I'm hoping to talk to more." Naomi looked at her. "Agnes, He has been running this town on isolation and bad information for years. The only reason it's worked is because everyone who had a piece of the story kept it to themselves, either because they were scared, or because they thought nobody would believe them, or because they didn't know there were other pieces. Agnes was quiet. "I'm tired of the isolation working," Naomi said. "Aren't you?" Agnes looked at her for a long moment. She thought of her husband, 11 years working for Doyle, what he'd been paid for that work and what it had cost him. "Yeah," she said, "I'm tired of it." "Good." Naomi stood up and rolled down her sleeves. "Then help me make a list of everyone who might have a story, everyone you've heard things about, even just rumors. I'll decide which ones are worth following up." Agnes reached for paper. It wasn't until after they'd been working for an hour, after the list had grown longer than either of them had expected, after the room had gotten dark and Naomi had lit the lamp and neither of them had mentioned stopping, it was only then that Agnes said quietly, without looking up from the paper, "He came back because of you, Reed. Whatever reasons he gives about letters and silence, the real reason he came back is because he couldn't make sense of a world where you didn't matter to him." Naomi kept her eyes on the paper in front of her. "We're not talking about Silas right now." "I know, I'm just saying it while you're too busy to argue with me." There was a pause. "That's not a fair use of the situation," Naomi said. "No," Agnes agreed. "It's not." They went back to work. The lamp burned low and then lower. Outside, Dustfall Ridge settled into the silence it wore every night, the quiet that felt like peace if you didn't know what was underneath it. Naomi added another name to the list. She was not running from anything. She was not waiting for anything. She was building something. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was building it alone. That didn't make it simple. Nothing about this was simple. Frank Doyle had money and connections and 3 years head start on the kind of quiet damage that was hardest to undo. The people she needed to talk to were tired and scared and had good reasons to stay that way. The man who'd just come back into her life was someone she still didn't fully trust herself to read clearly, and she knew that was a problem she couldn't afford to ignore just because it was inconvenient. But the list had 12 names on it by the time they blew out the lamp. 12 names was a start. She folded the paper and put it in her apron pocket and carried it upstairs with her and set it on the table beside the bed where she could see it when she woke up, so she didn't waste any time remembering what she was doing and why. She lay in the dark and listened to the wind move through the valley outside. The same wind that had been moving through this place for 100 years, long before Frank Doyle got his hands on any of it, long before any of them had arrived with their needs and their plans and their small separate griefs. It occurred to her somewhere between waking and sleep that Frank Doyle's real advantage was not his money or his connections. It was the fact that for years everyone in his path had been responding to him, reacting, defending. Nobody had been coming at him. She was going to change that. The thought settled in her chest alongside everything else she was carrying, the anger, the grief she hadn't fully named yet, the complicated and inconvenient hope that had arrived with a rider from the North Road 3 days ago. And she held all of it there, the whole complicated weight of it, and let herself feel it without running from any peace. Then she closed her eyes and slept. Ruth Alderman's property sat 3 miles out on the creek road, far enough from town that the wind sounded different out there, less like something moving through and more like something staying. The house was small and well kept in the way that things are kept by a person who is alone and has decided that letting things go would mean something she wasn't ready to accept. Naomi rode out on a borrowed horse on Monday morning. She'd told Agnes where she was going and left her in charge of the day's work, which Agnes had accepted without comment, which was its own kind of support. Ruth Alderman came to the door before Naomi had finished tying the horse. She was a compact woman in her mid-50s, gray coming through brown hair, eyes that had the particular quality of someone who has learned to assess a situation before committing to a feeling about it. "Miss Carter," she said. Not surprised, not unwelcoming, just careful. "Mrs. Alderman, Opal Gentry suggested I come." Ruth looked at her for a moment, then stepped back from the door. "Come in then," she said. "Coffee's still warm." The inside of the house was clean and spare, with the kind of order that comes not from wealth, but from knowing exactly what you have and taking care of it. Ruth poured 2 cups without asking whether Naomi wanted one and set them on the table. Opal told you about the water rights, Ruth said. It wasn't a question. She mentioned Frank Doyle had been making offers. Offers? Ruth wrapped both hands around her cup. He's made 4. Each one comes with a deadline. Each deadline passes and nothing happens, and then a few months later there's another offer, a little lower than the last, and a new deadline. She looked at Naomi steadily. He's waiting me out. Has he done anything beyond the offers? Ruth was quiet for a moment. She turned her cup slightly on the table. Last spring, the irrigation channel that runs from the creek onto my east pasture got blocked. Big pile of debris. Could have been natural. We had a hard winter. Could have been helped along. She paused. Cost me 3 weeks of water access and 2 of my livestock. She looked up. I couldn't prove it. But you believe it wasn't natural. I believe Frank Doyle knows the value of patience when he's wearing someone down. She looked at Naomi directly. What is it you're actually here to ask me? Naomi set down her cup. I'm here to ask whether you'd be willing to write down what happened. The offers, the dates, the blocked channel. Everything you remember, as precisely as you remember it, and whether you'd be willing to let me share that account with anyone else who has a similar story. Ruth went very still. To what end? She said. To the end of having a record. A real one. In writing, from the people it happened to. Because right now, Frank Doyle operates in a town where everyone knows what he does and nobody has it on paper. Naomi held her eyes. He counts on that. Ruth was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the coffee in both cups started to cool. Who else are you talking to? She asked finally. I have a list, 11 other names, people who've had dealings with him that went wrong in ways they couldn't explain or couldn't fight. Does Doyle know you're doing this? Not yet. Ruth looked out the window at the pasture beyond. The creek was visible from here, a thin line of silver in the morning light. Her husband had dug that irrigation channel by hand 20 years ago when the land was new to them and everything felt possible. My husband spent his whole life on this property, she said. Not to Naomi quite, more to the window. He didn't leave it to me so I could hand it over to a man like Frank Doyle. She turned back. I'll write it down, she said. Everything, with dates. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Ruth picked up her cup. Thank me when it does something. By the end of that week, Naomi had spoken to 7 of the 12 names on her list. 3 of them declined. 1 too frightened, 1 who'd already made peace with his losses in a way the conversation wasn't going to reopen, and 1 who didn't trust that anything could be done and didn't want to spend hope on something likely to fail. She didn't push any of them. She understood all 3 positions. She'd lived inside each one at different points in the last 3 years. The 4 who agreed to talk gave her more than she'd expected. Not just stories, but in 2 cases, actual paperwork. Letters, receipts, original land agreements with notations that didn't match the final recorded versions. Joel Marsh, a rancher with a property on the Western Ridge, had kept every piece of paper related to a water rights dispute from 4 years back in a box under his bed, wrapped in oilcloth. He pulled it out and set it on the table like he'd been waiting for someone to ask for it. I kept this because I knew someday it would matter, he said. I just didn't know when. He was 63, broad through the shoulders, with the slow, deliberate manner of a man who thought before he spoke and meant what he said when he did. His wife Ellen sat in the corner and didn't say much, but she watched Naomi with an attention that felt like its own kind of endorsement. Can I make copies of these? Naomi asked. You can take the originals, Joel said. I've had enough of looking at them. She carried the oilcloth box back to town on her lap on the horse, both arms around it, more careful than she'd been with most things in recent memory. Silas was at the laundry building when she arrived, which was no longer surprising. He'd been showing up in small, useful ways over the past week. A repaired door hinge she hadn't asked him to fix, a load of firewood stacked neat against the back wall, 2 conversations on her behalf with people she hadn't had time to reach. He'd negotiated the arrangement with Bill Sutter's barn, which gave her a fallback location if she needed to move the operation before she found a permanent space. He'd done all of it without presenting any of it as something she owed him for, which was either genuine or very well managed, and she hadn't yet decided which. She trusted the actions more than she trusted her own judgment about what they meant. He saw the box in her arms and came to take the horse. "That's from Marsh?" he asked. 4 years of paperwork. She stepped down and held the box tighter. He kept everything. Silas tied the horse and looked at her with the focused attention he'd been giving to her plans since she'd let him into them 3 days ago. "Naomi, I know you've said to keep Doyle from knowing what you're doing, but at some point he's going to notice. He has people who watch." "I know." "So what's the plan when he does?" She looked at the box in her arms, then at Silas. "Then we need to be further along than he expects us to be," she said, "which means I need to move faster than I've been moving. How can I help?" "I need to get this paperwork to an attorney, not Doyle's people. A county attorney who doesn't owe him anything. There must be one." Silas thought, "Lester Haynes out of Birch Falls. He's about 40 miles east. I've heard his name as a man who works independent of the local arrangements. Can you reach him?" "I can ride out tomorrow." She looked at him for a moment. "That's a full day's travel?" "I know. I'll take 2 days." He said it simply. No flag planting, just a statement of what the situation required and what he was willing to do about it. She shifted the box in her arms. "All right," she said. "I'll have everything organized and written up for you to take by morning." She was up until past midnight working at the table by lamplight, copying out summaries of each account she'd gathered, organizing Joel Marsh's papers into a logical order, writing a letter to Lester Haynes that laid out the situation without overclaiming what she could prove and without underrepresenting what she strongly suspected. She wrote it 3 times. The first was too angry. The second was too careful. The third one said what needed to be said in the way a person could act on. Agnes came down at 10 o'clock in her robe and stood in the doorway. "You need to sleep." "I need to finish this." "Both things can be true." "I'll sleep when Silas leaves in the morning." She didn't look up from the page. "I don't want to give him half a package." Agnes looked at her for a moment. "You're trusting him with this." Naomi's pen kept moving. "I'm trusting him with a task. That's different." "Is it?" It wasn't a question exactly. Agnes went back upstairs without pressing it, which was the right call. Naomi kept writing. When she handed Silas the packet the next morning, the letter, the summaries, the inventory of Marsh's documents, he took it without opening it, folded it into his saddlebag, and looked at her. "I'll be back in 2 days," he said. "Be careful about who sees you leave with that." He nodded. "Anything else you need before I go?" She thought about it. Then she said, "Tell me straight, do you think this is going to work?" He was quiet for a moment. She could see him deciding whether to give her the comfortable answer or the real one. "I think it has a better chance than anything else anyone's tried," he said finally. "I think you've got more than Doyle knows you have, and that's the most important thing right now." He paused. "Whether it's enough, that I don't know. I'm not going to tell you I do." She appreciated that more than reassurance would have cost him. "All right," she said. "Ride safe." He rode out the north end of Mercer Street, and Naomi watched until he turned the corner, and then she went back inside to work. It was on the 9th day after Silas rode out. He'd been back for a week by then, with a letter from Lester Haynes agreeing to review the materials and a guarded but real interest in the water rights documentation, that Frank Doyle made his next move. Naomi heard about it first from Marta, who came into the laundry on a Tuesday with her face tight and her words arriving faster than usual. "He's calling a town meeting," Marta said. "This Friday, at the Assembly Hall. He's put notices up on 3 buildings. Naomi set down what she was holding. "What's the stated purpose?" "Doesn't say much. Community planning, the future of Dustfall Ridge." Marta looked at her. "Marta." Yet Clara Birch's husband was at the feed store when Doyle was telling Hicks about it, and he said Frank's planning to present some kind of formal contract arrangement, land use agreements. He's going to ask ranchers to sign. Naomi felt something go cold and alert in her chest. "When you say ask," Edgar Birch's word was that Frank already knows who he wants signatures from, and he's going to make it hard to say no in a room full of people. Marta's voice had dropped. "Public pressure. You know how he works." She did know. She'd heard the same technique described 4 different times in the last 2 weeks by 4 different people who'd experienced its specific weight. She went to find Silas. He was at the north end of town, helping Bill Sutter with a fence that had come down after a horse kicked through 2 rails. She caught him mid-morning, hammer in hand and a nail in his teeth. He pulled the nail out when he saw her face. What happened? Friday, town meeting. Frank's going to try to get signed agreements from the ranchers publicly. She watched him process it. If he gets signatures in a room full of witnesses, it becomes much harder to challenge those agreements later, even if we have documentation that the underlying terms are fraudulent. He's moving up his timeline, Silas said, because he knows something's happening. I don't know how much he knows, but he's moving. She looked at Silas steadily. We have 4 days. What do we need to do? I need to warn every person I've talked to. I need them to understand what he's going to try to do, and I need them to decide on their own terms whether they're going to walk into that room. And Haynes? I wrote to him last night, asked whether he could come himself or send someone who could be present Friday. That's 40 miles. I know. He may not be able to. She said it evenly. We have to be prepared for him not coming. Bill Sutter had been listening from behind the fence line with the air of a man pretending to be focused on his boards. Sutter, Silas said, without turning around. I'm not listening, Sutter said. Then you won't have heard that Doyle's calling a meeting Friday. There was a pause. I might have heard something about a meeting, Sutter said. Might have been planning to go. Might be good to go with some people, you know, Silas said, instead of walking in alone. Another pause. Might be, Sutter said, and went back to his boards. The next 4 days were the fastest and also the longest of Naomi's recent memory. She moved through them with the systematic focus that was her best defense against fear, because fear was a thing she felt. She'd given up pretending otherwise, at least to herself, and the only way she knew how to carry it without being carried by it was to keep doing the next necessary thing. She wrote out to Ruth Alderman, who listened to the news about Friday's meeting with her hands flat on her kitchen table and her face very still. He's going to try to get my water rights signature in a public room, Ruth said. He's going to try. Ruth looked at her. What's my position if I walk in there? You walk in knowing what you know, with your paperwork documented and a copy of your account filed with an independent attorney. Naomi held her eyes. You're not walking in alone. How many people are going? I don't know yet. I'm working on that. Ruth nodded slowly. Come back Thursday and tell me the count. I'll decide then. That was fair. Naomi accepted it and rode to the next name. Joel Marsh said yes without deliberation. I've been waiting 4 years to be in a room with that man where I had something to say, he said. I'm not missing that. 2 others said they'd come but stay quiet, which she also accepted. Not everyone had to speak. Sometimes the weight of a room was in the people standing still. On Thursday evening, a letter arrived for Naomi at the post office from Birch Falls. Hob Greer had it ready for her. No hesitation, no careful neutrality this time. He handed it over the counter without ceremony. It was from Lester Haynes. He couldn't come himself. But he had reviewed the Marsh documents, and he had written a formal assessment of the water rights agreements, which he enclosed, and which stated plainly that 2 of the recorded versions did not match the original agreements, and that there were grounds for a legal challenge. He also wrote, I know a county judge who has been watching this territory for some time. If you can get me signed testimonies from 3 or more affected parties, I can have this on his desk within 2 weeks. She read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her apron pocket alongside the folded paper with the 12 names on it, which had become something like a talisman over the last 2 weeks, a reminder of what she was building and why. She found Silas at the boarding house where he'd been staying and knocked on the door and told him about the letter. He sat on the edge of the bed and read it himself, slowly. Then he looked up. 3 signed testimonies, he said. I have 5 people willing to walk in Friday. If I can get 3 of them to put their names on a formal statement before the meeting. Today's Thursday. I know. He stood up. Tell me which 3 and where they live. I'll ride tonight if I have to. She looked at him. You don't have to do that. I know I don't have to. He said it simply. Tell me which 3. There was a moment between them that she didn't name, because naming it would require her full attention, and she couldn't afford that right now. She just looked at him. At the man who had been gone for 3 years and had come back and had been showing up every day in ways that were small and consistent and not at all heroic, which was exactly what the situation required. And she thought about what Agnes had said about the real reason he came back. She thought about it. And then she told him the 3 names and where they lived. He was back by 10 o'clock that night with 2 of the 3. The third, Joel Marsh, had already written his own statement without being asked and sent it through his neighbor to the post office that afternoon, addressed to Naomi, sealed with wax. Of course he had. She had 3 signed statements. She wrote a cover letter to accompany them to Haynes, marked it for delivery first thing Friday morning, and set it on the table next to the lamp. Then she sat back in her chair and pressed her hands flat on the table and let herself feel for about 30 seconds the full weight of what she'd built in 11 days. The fear in it. The doubt, because there was doubt. This was not a guaranteed thing, it was a possible thing. And possible was not the same as certain. The exhaustion that she'd been pushing back every morning. And underneath all of that, quieter than the rest, something that wasn't quite triumph and wasn't quite relief, but was something in that territory. The feeling of having done the next necessary thing, and then the next one after that, until the stack of necessary things had become something that resembled a plan. Agnes knocked on the open door frame. "Reed's downstairs," she said. "Says he'll walk with you tomorrow." Naomi looked at the letter on the table. "Tell him I know," she said. Agnes waited. "Tell him I'm glad," Naomi added. Agnes turned to go, then stopped. "For what it's worth," she said, "from where I'm standing, you're both scared and you're both showing up anyway. There's worse things to build on than that." She left before Naomi could respond, which was, again, the right call. The morning of the town meeting, Dustfall Ridge had the particular charged quality of a place where something is about to happen, and most of the people in it don't know what yet. The sky was clear and too bright. The wind had dropped to almost nothing, which was unusual enough to notice. On the main road, horses and wagons arrived through the morning hours as people came in from the surrounding properties, drawn by Doyle's notices and the general communal gravity of a called meeting. Naomi dressed carefully, not to impress anyone. She was past performing for other people's expectations, but she chose her cleanest dress and pinned her hair with precision because she understood that the way you walked into a room said something about how seriously you expected to be taken, and she intended to be taken seriously. Agnes walked with her to the assembly hall. Ruth Alderman arrived on horseback from her property and dismounted in front of the building at the same moment, which felt deliberate even though it wasn't planned. Ruth saw Naomi, and something moved across her face. Not quite a smile, but the muscle near one, and she fell into step beside her. Joel Marsh was already inside, seated 3rd row from the back on the right side. He had his hat on his knee. He did not look like a man who was afraid exactly. He looked like a man who had been waiting for this particular Tuesday for 4 years. Bill Sutter came in with 2 of his ranch hands and sat on the left side. He didn't acknowledge Naomi or Silas. That was fine. The hall filled over the next half hour. There were perhaps 40 people in it by the time Frank Doyle walked to the front, a number that was more than Naomi had hoped and enough to matter. Frank Doyle was a big man, not tall but wide through the chest, with the groomed confidence of someone who had spent years in rooms where everyone else was expecting him to be in charge. He wore a good coat, his boots were clean. He looked at the assembled room with the benevolent authority of a man who considered himself a caretaker of other people's interests. "Thank you all for coming," he said. "I'll get to the point. This territory's been struggling for resources and stability long enough. I'm proposing a set of cooperative land use agreements that will consolidate water access, share infrastructure costs, and give every participating property a stable return." He paused to let that sit. "I have the agreements here." He held up a stack of papers. "They're straightforward. I've had them reviewed by my own legal counsel. Anyone who wants to read them before signing, you're welcome to. I'm also happy to answer questions." The questions he got from the room were the soft kind at first. When would payments begin? What happened if someone wanted to exit the agreement? How were disputes handled? He answered all of them smoothly, with the ease of a man who had rehearsed this particular performance many times. Naomi sat in the 4th row and watched him work the room and felt the cold, precise anger she'd been carrying for 11 days settle into something she could use. She waited until he had finished the 4th question. She waited until he was scanning the room with the satisfied expression of a man who believed the hard part was behind him. Then she stood up. Frank Doyle's eyes moved to her immediately. Something shifted in his expression. Not much, but it was there. A calculation happening very quickly behind very controlled eyes. "Miss Carter," he said, pleasantly. "You have a question?" "I do." She held the copy of Lester Haynes's formal assessment in her hand where he could see it. "I'd like to know whether the land use agreements you're proposing use the same recorded language as the original agreements, or a modified version." The room went quiet in a specific way, the way a room goes quiet when it understands that something has shifted. Doyle looked at the paper in her hand. "I'm not sure what you're referring to," he said. "I'm referring to the water rights agreement between your operation and the Marsh property, recorded 4 years ago." She did not look away from him. "I have a legal assessment from an independent county attorney indicating that the recorded version of that agreement differs materially from the original signed document. I'd like to know whether the agreements you're presenting today carry the same discrepancy." The silence in the room had a quality to it now. It wasn't just quiet. It was the sound of 40 people recalculating. Joel Marsh did not stand up. He simply set his hat on his knee and looked at Doyle with the unblinking patience of someone who has all day. Ruth Alderman, 2 seats away from Naomi, folded her hands in her lap. Frank Doyle looked at Naomi with a smile that didn't quite reach any part of his face that would have meant it. "Miss Carter," he said, "I don't know where you got—" "I'd also like to ask," she said, and she did not raise her voice. She did not need to, because the room was already giving her its full attention. "About Court Teller." Something moved across Doyle's face then, just for a second. Something he pulled back quickly, but not quite quickly enough. "I don't see what relevance—" "He drove the Eastern Stage Loop for 8 months, Naomi said. Before that, he worked for you. During those 8 months, there were documented log discrepancies in his route, personal correspondence that was received but never delivered." She held Doyle's eyes. "I'm curious whether those discrepancies only affected my mail, or whether others in this room might have experienced similar interruptions." She didn't look around the room when she said it. She kept her eyes on Frank Doyle, but she heard the sound of other people shifting in their seats. The particular quality of that sound. The way recognition moves through a room when something that was private turns out to be shared. Bill Sutter cleared his throat from the left side. Frank Doyle stood at the front of the room with his stack of papers and his clean boots and the smile that had stopped working, and he looked at Naomi Carter with the expression of a man who had made a calculation 3 years ago and was now being asked to account for every step of it. He had expected her to stay quiet. He had built an entire system on the expectation that people would stay quiet. She looked back at him with the steady, clear-eyed regard of someone who had spent 3 years building the patience and the knowledge and the sheer, unadorned nerve to stand in this room on this morning and refuse to. The papers in his hand shifted, just slightly. He was not finished. She knew that. Men like Frank Doyle did not walk out of a room and concede. He would recalibrate. He would find another angle. But the room had heard her. And in Dustfall Ridge, where information had been controlled and isolated for so long, what the room had heard could not be taken back. That was enough for now. That was exactly enough. The meeting broke apart the way things break when the structure holding them together turns out to be less solid than everyone assumed. Not with a dramatic collapse, with a slow, awkward dissolution. People standing, people looking at each other, people deciding not to sign anything today, and finding reasons to leave that didn't require them to say why out loud. Frank Doyle did not lose his composure in the room. She had not expected him to. He was too practiced for that. He smiled and said the meeting had been productive, and that he was happy to address any concerns individually, and that the agreements would remain available for review. He said all of it in the smooth, unruffled tone of a man who had been challenged before and knew how to absorb it without showing damage. But nobody signed. That was the thing. 40 people came into that room, and not one of them put their name on his papers. Naomi walked out of the assembly hall with Agnes on one side and Ruth Alderman on the other, and she did not look back to see Frank Doyle's face, because she didn't need to. She could feel the shape of what had happened without needing to watch him process it. Silas was waiting outside, leaning against the hitching rail with his arms crossed and his hat pulled low. When she came out, he looked at her with a question on his face that he didn't put into words. "Nobody signed," she said. He let out a slow breath. How did he take it? Like a man calculating what comes next. She stopped beside him. Because that's what he's doing right now. We need to move fast. Haynes needs the testimonies by, I know, 3 days. She already had it mapped. I'm going to write to him tonight with what happened in the meeting. I want a record of the public context, and I need Joel Marsh and Ruth to formalize their statements this week. Not just signed, but witnessed. Who's your witness? Opal Gentry. She's known in this county longer than any of Doyle's people. Her name on a document means something. Silas nodded. He pushed off the rail and fell into step beside her as she started down the street. What do you need me to do? She thought about it. Nothing tonight. Tonight I need to think. She paused. You've been running pieces of this for 2 weeks, and I haven't... She stopped again. Started differently. I know what you've been doing. I want you to know I see it. He was quiet for a moment. You don't owe me anything for it. I know I don't. That's not why I'm saying it. She looked at him sideways. I'm saying it because I'm not very good at acknowledging help when someone gives it. I'm trying to be better at that. He looked at the road ahead of them. You're better at it than you think, he said. She didn't answer that, but she didn't move away from walking beside him either, which she noticed and let stand. Frank Doyle's response came faster than she'd anticipated, which meant he'd had it partly prepared, which meant he'd known the meeting might not go the way he'd staged it. By Saturday morning, 3 days after the assembly hall, Naomi received a formal notice from a county office. It cited an outstanding debt against the laundry operation, not the building, which he owned, the business itself. A licensing fee from 18 months ago that she had paid and had a receipt for, being disputed now as insufficient. The notice gave her 14 days to respond or face suspension of her operating license. She sat with the notice on the work table and read it twice. Then she set it down very carefully. Agnes came in from the back room, took one look at her face, and picked up the notice without asking. She read it. Then she set it back down. Do you have your receipt? Agnes asked. Yes. Then this is harassment. Yes. Naomi looked at the notice. It's also a distraction. He wants me spending the next 2 weeks running to the county office to fight a paperwork dispute while he recalibrates. So what do you do? I send Haynes the receipt as an exhibit, and I add this notice to the record as evidence of retaliation. She picked up the paper. And I don't let it slow me down. She wrote to Haynes that afternoon. A longer letter than the first, now including the timeline of events from the meeting, the names of the 40 people present, and the notice she'd received 48 hours later. She noted that Joel Marsh and Ruth Alderman had agreed to formalize their testimonies and would have them witnessed by Opal Gentry by Tuesday. Then she walked the letter to the post office herself and stood at Hob Greer's window and watched him put it directly into the outbasket, and Hob looked at her with the small particular nod of a man who understood the significance of what he was handling. It'll be on tomorrow's early run, he said. Thank you, Hob. Miss Carter, he paused. Court teller hasn't worked this route in 2 years, but he's still in the county, Birch Falls area, in case that matters to anyone. She held his eyes. In case it matters to an attorney reviewing stage route logs? In case, he said, and went back to his work. She added that to her letter to Haynes that evening in a postscript. She'd already sealed it, so she wrote a second short note and addressed it separately to arrive alongside the first. She was not sleeping well. That was a simple fact she was managing rather than dwelling on. She woke up at 2 or 3 in the morning with her mind already moving, working through angles, checking the sequence of things she'd done against the sequence of things she still needed to do. She'd get up and sit at the table in the dark and make notes by feel until she was tired enough to lie down again. And sometimes that took an hour, and sometimes it didn't come before morning. She was tired in a way that ran deeper than one night's sleep would fix, and she knew it, and she kept going anyway, because the alternative was stopping, and stopping right now would give Frank Doyle exactly the room he needed. It was Silas who noticed the depth of it before she'd fully acknowledged it herself. He came by on Sunday morning with a covered dish that he set on the work table without explanation. She looked at it, then at him. I don't need to be fed, she said. I didn't say you did. I had extra. He looked at her face with the calm attention he'd been giving to things lately, the kind that didn't flinch from what it found. When did you last sleep more than 4 hours? I sleep fine. Naomi. She looked at him for a moment. I sleep enough. That's not the same answer. She sat down, which she hadn't meant to do, but her feet were apparently done arguing. She pulled the cover off the dish. Eggs, biscuits, something that smelled like it had been cooked with more care than she usually allowed herself on a Sunday. Sit down if you're going to stay, she said. He sat across from her. They ate in silence for a few minutes, which was its own particular kind of comfort, the kind that comes from being with someone who doesn't need the air filled. Outside, the Sunday quiet of Dustfall Ridge sat over the street. Less wagon traffic, a dog somewhere barking twice and then stopping. What happens if Haynes can't get to the judge in time by? Silas said. Not to alarm her, just asking the things she'd been asking herself at 3 a.m. She finished chewing before she answered. Then I have a different problem than the one I've been solving. I'd need to find another route to the same place. Which is? Getting this in front of someone with the authority to suspend Doyle's recorded agreements while the originals are reviewed. She set her fork down. Haynes says a judge can issue a temporary hold on any land transactions pending investigation if there's sufficient evidence of fraud. That hold buys the ranchers time. It stops Doyle from filing any new versions of his agreements until the old ones are cleared or challenged. And if we can't get the hold, then we go back to what we have, which is a public record of what happened at the meeting and signed testimonies, and an attorney who believes the case is real. She looked at him. It's less, but it's not nothing, and it's more than anyone's had before. He was quiet for a moment. You've thought through every version of this, haven't you? It's what I do at 3 a.m. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, something in that direction. You were always the one who thought through every version, he said. And you were always the one who rode straight into something without thinking through any of them, she said. It came out without heat, just as a fact they both recognized. Yeah, he said. That's fair. You've been different about it these past weeks. He looked at his plate. I had a lot of time on the road to think about what doing things wrong looks like. He paused. What it costs. She looked at him. He was not performing contrition, which was the thing she'd been watching for. The thing she didn't trust from men who'd hurt you and came back wanting to be forgiven. He wasn't playing the part of a changed man. He was just different in the specific and unremarkable way that people change when they've carried something long enough to be reshaped by it. She didn't know yet what to do with that. Eat your breakfast, she said. He ate his breakfast. Opal Gentry witnessed the testimonies on Tuesday, seated at Ruth Alderman's kitchen table with Ruth on one side and Joel Marsh on the other, his oilcloth box of papers open in front of him. Naomi sat across from them. Silas waited outside, which was the right place for him to be. This wasn't his thing to be in the middle of. Opal read each statement slowly, the way she did everything, with the thoroughness of someone who had seen documents manipulated enough times to know where the weaknesses could be. When she finished Ruth's, she asked 3 clarifying questions. When she finished Joel's, she asked 1. Then she picked up the pen and signed her name in the witness line with the decisive stroke of a woman who understood what she was doing and had decided to do it without reservation. You know what this makes me? Opal said to Naomi. Not a complaint, just a statement of fact. It makes you a witness to a legal document, Naomi said. It makes me a woman who publicly sided against Frank Doyle. Yes, I know. I'm grateful, Opal. Opal looked at her for a long moment. Then she capped the pen and set it down. My husband sided against his father once, she said, 30 years ago. There was a water dispute, and Thomas stood with the smaller rancher because he knew it was right, and Frank Doyle's father made his life difficult for 2 years after. She folded her hands on the table. Thomas said later that he'd do it again, that it was the most comfortable he'd slept in years, the night after he decided. She looked at Ruth, then at Joel, then back at Naomi. I expect I'll sleep well tonight, she said. Ruth made coffee, and they stayed at the table for an hour, talking in the low, practical way of people who have just done something that cannot be undone and are beginning to understand what that means. It was not triumphant. It was sober, the kind of conversation that happens when the doing of a hard thing is still more present than the result of it. Naomi rode back toward town with the witness testimonies in her bag and Silas beside her on the road, and neither of them spoke for a while. She signed both of them, he he said finally, without hesitation. How many people surprised you through this? He asked. People who came through differently than you expected? She thought about it honestly. Most of them, in both directions. She looked at the road ahead. Some I thought would be braver weren't. Some I thought would be too scared came through with everything they had. She paused. People are harder to predict than I used to think, or maybe I just understand less than I assumed I did. That's a thing you learn on the road, Silas said. You ride through enough places and meet enough people, and you start to realize the categories you put them in aren't as solid as they felt. What did 3 years on the road teach you? Honestly. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, that I was running from the one thing I actually wanted. He said it to the road, not to her. And that I was smart enough to know I was doing it, and not smart enough to stop until I'd done it long enough that stopping felt like too much to ask of myself. She heard it land the way it was meant to, without decoration. That's honest, she said. You asked for honest. I know, I appreciate it. They rode in silence for another stretch. The late afternoon sun was getting low, cutting long shadows across the road. Naomi, he said, after this is over, I'm not going to pressure you about anything. I want to say that plainly. Whatever we work out between us, that's separate from what you're doing right now. I don't want you thinking I've been helping because I expect something. She looked at him. I know that. Do you? I wouldn't have let you help if I didn't. She held his eyes for a moment. You're not a man who does things to collect debts. You never were. That wasn't your flaw. What was my flaw? She turned back to the road. You ran from things you wanted and called it freedom. He didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything to say. Lester Haynes's response arrived on Thursday. It was longer than his previous letters and more formal in its language, which Naomi took as a sign that he was treating the situation as a serious matter rather than a preliminary inquiry. He had reviewed the witness testimonies and the Marsh documents. He had spoken by telegraph to a colleague in the county seat regarding the stage route discrepancies, and that colleague had confirmed that Court Teller was currently known to them in connection with a separate postal interference matter that had been under quiet review for 8 months. Teller, it seemed, had not only been paid to intercept correspondence on the Dustfall Ridge Eastern Loop. He had done the same thing on 2 other routes, for 2 other clients, in 2 other towns. The postal interference matter had been waiting for enough documented cases to move forward. Naomi read that paragraph 3 times. She was not the only one. There were other towns, other people who had been kept from information they were entitled to, other relationships broken, other decisions made in the dark because someone had been paid to keep the light out. The anger she felt reading that was a different quality than the personal anger she'd been carrying. It was wider, colder. The kind of anger that comes from understanding a thing is not the size you thought it was. Haynes wrote that he had contacted the county judge, the one he'd mentioned, and that the judge had agreed to review the documentation with the possibility of issuing a temporary hold on Doyle's land transactions pending investigation. He needed one more thing, a statement from someone with direct knowledge of the instruction given to Teller, not just the pattern of interception, but the source of the direction. Naomi set the letter down. Putnam, the stage office manager. He told her Teller hadn't acted alone on most things. He told her to look at the county official named Burris, but Burris was one step removed from Doyle, and Doyle was the name Haynes needed attached to the instruction. She needed Putnam to put his name on what he knew. She went to Silas. He was at the north end of town again, this time helping a neighbor repair a wheel on a wagon that had cracked coming in from the eastern road. He saw her face and handed off the work without explanation. She told him what Haynes needed. He listened all the way through. Putnam told you Teller didn't act alone, he said. He said it carefully, without committing to what he knew. Do you think he has direct knowledge of Doyle's involvement? I think he's a careful man who's been running a stage operation in Doyle's territory for 6 years and has been watching what happens to people who say the wrong things. She looked at him. I think he knows more than he told me. And I think what's changed since I talked to him is that there are now witness testimonies, an attorney, a telegraph to the county seat, and 40 people who sat in a meeting and heard a woman publicly named Court Teller in front of Frank Doyle. Silas was quiet for a moment. You want me to talk to him, he said. I want us both to talk to him. But I don't want to go in asking for more than he's ready to give. I want to show him where we are and let him decide whether he wants to step to this side of the line or stay where he is. And if he says no, then we find another way. She paused. But I think he won't say no. I think he's been waiting for the right moment the same way some of the others were. He just needed to know it wasn't going to be wasted. Putnam was behind his desk when they came in, which was where he always was, and he looked at them both with the careful assessment of a man who had been expecting something like this but wasn't certain of the form it would take. Naomi set Haynes's letter on his desk without preamble. She didn't ask him to read it. She just put it there, where he could see the letterhead, the length of it, the professional formality of the language. "We have testimonies," she said. "We have an attorney who has been in contact with a county judge. We have a connection to a separate postal investigation in 2 other towns that is going to move forward with or without what you know." She held his eyes. "What we don't have is someone who can speak to the instruction, who gave Teller his direction." Putnam looked at the letter. He didn't pick it up. "If I put my name on something like that," he said, "I am done in this county. Not just this territory, this county. If Frank Doyle's agreements hold and this town keeps going the way it's been going," Naomi said, "a lot of people are done in this county. The question is whether you'd rather be done because you stayed quiet or because you said something true." Putnam looked at her with the expression of a man who did not appreciate being made to see something he'd been avoiding but couldn't honestly argue with. "I don't have a direct link to Doyle," he said. "I have Burris. And I have what Burris told me when he recommended Teller, which is that the man came with certain," he chose the word carefully, "expectations around discretion regarding particular routes." He used that word? Discretion? He used several words. That was the most polite one. "Would you write down what he told you, exactly as you remember it?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked at Silas. "You the one who rode to Birch Falls?" he said. Silas looked at him steadily. "Yes." "Why?" Silas seemed to consider how to answer. "Because something wrong was done, and the person it was done to deserved to have someone run an errand on her behalf." He said it without any particular weight, just plainly. Putnam looked at Naomi again. He looked at the letter on his desk. "Give me until tomorrow morning," he said. "I want to sleep on what I'm willing to write down and how I'm willing to say it." "That's fair," Naomi said. She picked up Haynes's letter, which Putnam had still not touched. She put it back in her bag. "Mr. Putnam," she said at the door, "thank you for telling me to come in the first place. When I came asking about Teller, you could have said nothing." He looked at her with something that wasn't quite pride, but was in the neighborhood. "I told you he didn't act alone on most things," he said. "You did," she said. "I remembered." Putnam's statement arrived at the laundry building the following morning, hand-delivered by his assistant, written in the precise and functional language of a man who had spent his career managing documentation and understood what made a written account useful versus what made it merely emotional. He did not name Doyle directly. He named Burris, and he quoted Burris's exact language about the route and the expectations around it, and he attached a copy of the log entry he had kept at the time, his own private notation, separate from the official record, that documented the conversation. It was, Naomi thought, reading it at the table while Agnes stood over her shoulder and read it too. Exactly the kind of thing a judge could use as a thread to pull. "He kept his own notes," Agnes said. "He runs a careful operation," Naomi said. "He's been covering himself for years in case this day came." "Smart man." "Frightened man," Naomi said. Both things at once. She packaged everything together that evening. The Haynes letter, the Marsh documents, the 3 witness testimonies, Putnam's statement and attachment, her own written account of the meeting and the retaliatory notice she'd received afterward, and a timeline she'd compiled that laid out every event in sequence, dated, with the relevant documentation cited beside each entry. It was 11 pages. She tied it together with a length of string from the supply drawer and set it on the table and looked at it. Silas came in from outside where he'd been fixing a broken shutter Agnes had mentioned that morning. He saw the package on the table and stopped. "That's everything?" he said. "That's everything I have." He looked at it for a moment. "It's more than I expected when this started." Me too, she said. He looked at her, not at the package, at her. You built this in 2 weeks, he said. Out of a list of 12 names and a conversation with Hob Greer. And a box of oilcloth papers under Joel Marsh's bed. She looked at the package. And people who'd been waiting for someone to ask. Naomi. He said her name in a way that made her look up. I know you don't want the full conversation yet. I know you're not ready, and I said I'd wait, and I meant it. He paused. But I want to say one thing, and then I'll let it alone. She looked at him. I came back because the numbers didn't add up, he said. That's what I told you. That's true. But the reason the numbers mattered, the reason I couldn't make peace with them, is because you're the most real thing I've ever left behind. He said it without drama. The way you say something when you've been carrying it a long time and it's come down to the simplest possible shape. And I was too much of a coward to say that clearly until I'd made it worse. I know I made it worse. I'm not asking you to overlook that. I just needed you to have the full version. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about 3 years of silence she now knew hadn't been his choice. She thought about 3 years of mornings at the post office window and Hob Greer's apologetic face. She thought about what it meant that the silence had been engineered by a man who understood that isolation was the most efficient tool for control, and that she and Silas had both been controlled by it without knowing it, and that in some ways that made what happened between them not a failure of love, but a failure of information. She also thought, and this was the part she didn't push away, because it was true, and she was done running from things that were true, that what she felt when he looked at her was not the same feeling she'd had 3 years ago. It was more complicated, harder. It had weight in it that the earlier version hadn't, the weight of everything that had happened and everything she'd learned and everything she'd become in the space his absence had left. But it was still there. That was the thing she'd been slowly admitting to herself at 3 a.m. when the notes were set aside and the lamp was low and it was just her in the dark with what was true. I heard you, she said. Okay. That's all I'm ready to say right now. I know. He picked up his coat from the chair. I'll ride to the county seat in the morning. Get that to Haynes in person instead of by mail. She looked at the package on the table. It's a 2-day ride. Then I'll be back in 4 days, like... He met her eyes. I'll come back. The way he said it, I'll come back, was not a promise designed to be impressive. It was a statement from a man who had spent 3 years learning what it cost to not come back, and had stopped treating that lesson as something he'd already learned enough from. She picked up the package and held it out to him. He took it from her hands. His fingers were warm from working outside, and where they brushed hers, she didn't move away. She didn't lean toward it either. She just let it be what it was. 2 people's hands passing something important between them. And then she let go. 4 days, she said. 4 days, he said. He left. She listened to his boots on the stairs, and then the door, and then the quiet after. Agnes appeared in the doorway of the back room, not pretending she hadn't heard any of it. Well, she said. Don't, Naomi said. I wasn't going to say anything. You were. Agnes pressed her lips together. Sleep tonight is all. Will you do that? Actually sleep. Naomi looked at the empty table where the package had been. 11 pages. 2 weeks. 12 names become 7, become 4, become the weight of a thing she'd built and sent out into the world and couldn't control anymore. Yes, she said. I'll sleep. She meant it. She thought she might actually be able to. He came back in 3 days instead of 4. Naomi was at the washboards on Wednesday morning when she heard a horse on Mercer Street moving faster than the usual Wednesday pace, and something in the rhythm of it made her dry her hands before she'd consciously decided to. She was at the door when Silas came around the corner of the building, still in his riding coat, dust on him from the road. She looked at his face and knew immediately it was not bad news. It was something else, something that had the quality of a door opening rather than closing. Haynes went to the judge Monday night, Silas said. He was out of breath, not from exertion, but from having held something in for 3 days of riding. The judge reviewed the Marsh documents and Putnam's statement and the testimonies. Yesterday morning, he issued a temporary hold on all of Doyle's recorded land agreements in this territory pending formal investigation. Naomi stood in the doorway and let that arrive. All of them, she said. Every agreement filed in the last 7 years that involves water rights or land use contracts in Dustfall Ridge and the surrounding 3 properties. Silas reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document. Haynes sent a certified copy for you to keep. The original is filed at the county seat. She took the document from him. It was heavy paper, the kind county offices used for things that were meant to last. She unfolded it slowly and read the first paragraph, which was formal and dense and contained the words, "Temporary injunction and pending investigation of fraudulent misrepresentation," and the name of a judge she didn't know, but who had apparently read 11 pages of documentation and decided it warranted his attention. "It's not permanent," Silas said. She could hear him reading her carefully, making sure she understood. "It's a hold. Doyle can challenge it. There'll be a formal hearing." "When?" 6 weeks. Haynes will represent the ranchers' interests at the hearing. He said the Putnam statement is the strongest piece. That conversation Burris had with Putnam about expectations around discretion on the route is documented in Putnam's own handwriting from the time it happened. That's not something that can be called constructed after the fact. She folded the document back along its lines and held it in both hands. "And the postal investigation?" she asked. "The colleague Haynes contacted in the county seat. He's coordinating with the investigation that was already underway. Teller is going to be interviewed formally. Burris, too." He paused. "Doyle's name is in the inquiry now. Whether they can prove he gave the instruction directly is still uncertain, but his name is in it." She nodded. She looked at the document in her hands. Then she looked at the street behind Silas, at the ordinary Wednesday morning of Dustfall Ridge going about its business. A wagon passing, 2 women talking near the dry goods store, a dog lying in a patch of sun outside the barber. And she thought about how much had happened underneath the surface of this ordinary-looking place, how much damage had been done quietly, how many people had been living in manufactured isolation without knowing the walls around them had been built by a man with a financial interest in keeping them separated. "It's a start," she said. "It's more than a start." He looked at her steadily. "Do you understand what you did?" "I made a list," she said. "And then I followed it." "Naomi, I'm serious. That's what I did. I made a list and I asked people questions and I believed them when they answered." She looked at the document again. The rest of it was already there. The paperwork was under Joel Marsh's bed. Putnam's notes were in his desk. Ruth's memory of every date and every blocked irrigation channel was sitting in her head, just waiting for someone to ask her to write it down. She looked up at him. "I didn't build anything that wasn't already there. I just connected it." "That's what building is," he said. Agnes appeared in the doorway behind Naomi, looked at Silas, looked at the document in Naomi's hands, and said, "Well?" "Temporary injunction," Naomi said. "Formal hearing in 6 weeks." Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then she sat down on the step, which was not something Agnes typically did, and pressed both hands to her knees and looked at the ground. 11 years, she said. Not to anyone in particular. My husband worked for that man for 11 years. Nobody said anything. There wasn't anything to say that would have been adequate to that, so they let it sit, the 3 of them, in the particular silence that gathers around things that should have happened sooner and didn't. Then Agnes stood up, smoothed her apron, and went back inside. "I've got washing to finish," she said. "Somebody around here still has to work." Naomi told Opal Gentry that afternoon. Opal listened to the whole thing without interrupting, seated in her kitchen with her coffee in her hands, and when Naomi finished, she was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to mean something. "Thomas would have wanted to see this," she said finally. Her husband, 30 years gone. The man who'd sided with the smaller rancher and been made to feel the cost of it. He would have said it took too long, but he would have been glad. Naomi looked at her. "So would a lot of people." Opal set down her cup. "You know Frank Doyle is not going to sit still for 6 weeks. No, he's not. He's going to find every legal angle he can to challenge the hold. He's going to put pressure on anyone he thinks he can move. He has money, and he has people who owe him things, and that doesn't change because a judge issued a piece of paper." "I know," Naomi said. "That's why Haynes needs to hear from anyone else who's willing to come forward before the hearing. The more documented accounts he has, the stronger the case is." She held Opal's eyes. "I'm going back to the 3 people who said no the first time. I'm not going to pressure them, but I want them to know what's changed." Opal looked at her for a long moment. "You're going to keep going," Opal said. "Not a question. Until it's done." Opal nodded slowly. "I'll make some calls of my own," she said. "There are people in this county I've known for 40 years who haven't talked to you yet. People who dealt with Doyle's father and recognized the patterns in the son." She picked up her cup again. "Old women know things, Naomi. We've just learned to keep quiet about them because nobody asked." Naomi thought about that on the ride back toward town, about all the things that existed in people's memories and desk drawers and oilcloth boxes that never became part of any official record because the circumstances that would have required them never fully materialized, about how much evidence of wrongdoing simply aged out of usefulness because the moment for it passed before someone had the will to collect it. She had been part of that pattern herself. For 3 years, she'd carried her knowledge of what Frank Doyle was and kept it private because there was no visible place to put it. Because speaking up felt like it required a certainty she didn't have, and a platform she hadn't earned, and a safety she couldn't guarantee. What she understood now, that she hadn't fully understood when she started making her list, was that the certainty wasn't a prerequisite. You didn't wait until you were certain to start. You started with what you had, and you let the starting attract the rest. She had gone to Ruth Alderman not knowing whether Ruth would talk to her. She had gone to Joel Marsh not knowing about the oilcloth box. She had walked into Putnam's office without any guarantee he'd say a word that mattered. Every step had been a step into uncertainty, and what had accumulated on the other side of all that uncertainty was 11 pages that were now sitting in a county judge's files. You started with what you had. Frank Doyle made his move on Thursday. It came in the form of a visit to Ruth Alderman's property. Not from Doyle himself, but from a man named Casson, who worked for Doyle's legal counsel and who arrived on Ruth's doorstep with a revised offer on the water rights and the particular tone of a man delivering a message whose full implications were meant to be felt rather than stated. Ruth sent him away. She sent word to Naomi the same afternoon through her neighbor's boy, who arrived at the laundry building with a folded note in his fist and the slightly breathless importance of someone trusted with a mission. The note said, "Cassin came. I sent him away. Wanted you to know. R." And Naomi wrote back, "You did right. Tell me if he comes again. NC." She told Silas about it that evening. He was at the laundry building, which had become a kind of informal headquarters over the past weeks in a way that nobody had planned, but that had simply evolved from the practical need for a central place where things could be organized and people could find each other. He listened without interrupting. "He's going after the individual people," Silas said, "trying to get someone to withdraw their testimony before the hearing, or to accept a private settlement that comes with a condition of silence." She looked at him. "Which is what he did with Clive Hooper, before any of us were paying attention. What do? We tell everyone who has a testimony filed to expect contact. We tell them what form it might take. We tell them they don't have to open the door." She paused. "And I write to Haynes and tell him that the inquiry has prompted immediate pressure on witnesses, so he has that on record for the hearing." She wrote the letter that night, 2 pages. Precise and without anger, because anger in a legal document was a thing that could be used against you, and she had learned from Haynes's own letters what measured and specific language looked like when it was doing its job. She also wrote a shorter letter to Hob Greer at the post office, asking him to let her know if any unusual correspondence arrived in town addressed to any of the names on her list. Not to hold it, not to interfere, just to let her know. She was not going to do to anyone what had been done to her, but she wanted to know what was moving. Hob, to his credit, wrote back the following morning with a single line, "Noted and understood. H.G." He added at the bottom, in different ink, as if it were an afterthought, "2 letters came through for the Marsh property this morning. I delivered them promptly." That last sentence was Hobbs' way of saying that whatever was in those letters, they had arrived intact and on time. That he had done his job the way it was meant to be done. She put the note in her pocket and felt something loosen slightly in her chest. Joel Marsh sent word 2 days later that he had received a letter from Doyle's counsel offering to resolve the 4-year water rights dispute with a cash payment in exchange for withdrawal of his testimony. He had written back, he said, to decline. He enclosed a copy of his decline letter for Naomi to forward to Haynes, which she did. The decline letter was 2 sentences. The second one said, "My testimony stands and will continue to stand." She read it and thought about the man who'd kept his papers in oilcloth under his bed for 4 years because he knew they would matter someday. People surprised you. That was the thing she kept coming back to. You thought you understood how much someone was willing to risk, and then they went further, and you had to revise your understanding of what people were capable of when the moment was right. The 4 weeks before the hearing were not quiet. They were the particular kind of not quiet that happens when something is moving through official channels, and the people affected by it are living in the uncertainty of not knowing the outcome while the outcome is being determined. Doyle's counsel filed 2 motions to dismiss the temporary hold. Both were denied. Burris, the county official who had recommended Teller for the stage route, resigned from his position on the 3rd week, which was not an admission of anything, technically, but which read as one to everyone who knew the context. Court Teller gave a formal statement to the postal investigation, the contents of which were not made public, but which Haynes communicated to Naomi in careful language as being significant to the broader inquiry. Naomi worked through all of it. She answered Haynes's questions promptly and completely. She kept her records organized. She ran the laundry every morning and took in her mending every afternoon and paid her bills and managed her business with the same steady attention she'd been giving it for 3 years, because the case that was moving through the system was important, but so was the life she'd built, and she was not going to let one consume the other. She was not always fine. There were evenings where the weight of the uncertainty settled on her chest in a way that was hard to lift. There were mornings where she woke at 3 and couldn't make the thinking productive, where it just ran in circles without landing anywhere useful. There was a Tuesday in the 3rd week where she burned a batch of washing because her attention had gone somewhere else, and she didn't notice until the smell hit her, and she stood in the back room of the laundry and was angry with herself in the specific, tired way you get angry when you're doing too much, and you know it, but you can't see what to put down. Silas found her in the back room that Tuesday. He didn't make a thing of it. He helped her sort out the damage, which was less than she'd feared, and then he made her sit down and brought her water from the pump, and sat across from her at the small table back there and didn't say anything for a few minutes. "You're allowed to be tired," he said. "I know that. You're allowed to not be managing it well every single day. I know that too." She pressed her fingers against her eyes. "I just needed a minute." "Take the minute." She took the minute. He sat there. It was a small thing. It was the right thing. They had been doing that more, sitting in the same space without it needing to be defined. She wasn't ready yet to put a shape on what they were to each other. She might not be ready for a while yet. What she knew was that the shape was forming on its own, out of accumulated small moments rather than any declaration. The way things form when you let them grow from what's real, instead of forcing them into a form you've decided on in advance. She knew she trusted him. That had taken longer than it should have, and it had earned it, which meant it was the real kind. She knew that when she thought about the future of Dustfall Ridge, the hearing, the injunction, the life after all of this, he was in the picture. Not prominently, not at the center, but present. The way a person is present when they've become part of how you understand your own days. She knew that was enough to work from, and she knew, more than she once had, that working from enough was how most good things got built. The hearing was held on a Thursday in the county seat, in a building Naomi had never been in before, with wood paneling and high windows and the particular smell of official spaces, paper, and something chemical, and the faint overlay of the many people who had passed through with their various needs and their various troubles. Lester Haynes was a small, compact man in his 60s, with a precise mustache and eyes that moved very quickly. He shook Naomi's hand when she arrived, and looked at her with the focused assessment she'd come to expect from people who had read her documentation. "You organized this clearly," he said. "That made the difference." "The people who talked to me made the difference," she said. "Both things are true," he said, and moved on to the next preparation. Joel Marsh was there, in his good coat. Ruth Alderman, who had driven her own wagon 40 miles and arrived the previous evening and found a room at the county hotel. Opal Gentry, who had taken the stage and who sat in the gallery with the particular upright posture of a woman who intends to witness something. Silas was there, at the back of the gallery, which was where he'd said he would be. Not at the table, not in the middle of it, but present. Frank Doyle arrived with 2 attorneys and a demeanor that still projected the authority of a man accustomed to being in control of rooms. He looked at Naomi when he came in. It was a brief look. She held it without any expression at all, which she thought probably cost him more than anger would have. The hearing took 4 hours. It was not dramatic in the way that resolutions sometimes are in stories, where the truth arrives in a sudden moment and the room gasps and everything is instantly clear. It was procedural and methodical and in places genuinely tedious, the way real legal processes are when they're working properly. Haynes presented the documentation in sequence. Doyle's counsel challenged it in sequence. The judge asked questions of both sides that were precise and not particularly warm toward either. Putnam's statement was entered into the record. The judge read it twice, which Naomi noticed. Joel Marsh was asked to confirm his testimony, which he did, in the same slow and deliberate manner with which he did everything, without embellishment and without backing away from a single date or detail. Ruth Alderman confirmed hers. Her voice was steady. Her hands, folded in her lap, were still. The judge recessed for 40 minutes. Naomi sat in the corridor outside with Haynes and Ruth and Joel and did not speak much. Joel had brought a small tin of hard candies from his pocket and passed it around, and they sat eating hard candy in a county courthouse corridor in near silence, which was so far removed from the dramatic version of this moment that Naomi found it almost funny, and she pressed her teeth together against the laugh, because this was not the moment for laughing, but she felt it there, the absurdity and the reality of it at the same time. The judge returned and delivered his ruling. The temporary hold was made permanent pending the outcome of the broader fraud investigation, which had now been formally opened by the county authority. All land use agreements filed by Frank Doyle involving water rights in the Dustfall Ridge territory within the past 7 years were suspended pending independent review of each agreement against its original signed version. Any agreements found to carry material discrepancies would be voided, and the affected properties would revert to their pre-agreement status. Doyle's counsel immediately filed a notice of intent to appeal. The judge noted it. The ruling stood. It was not over. That was the realistic version. The appeal would take time. The investigation would take time. There would be more paperwork and more delays and more moments of uncertainty. Frank Doyle was not going to dissolve because a judge had ruled against him on a Thursday in spring. He had money and he had people. And he had the particular resilience of a man who had been operating this way for a long time and had learned how to absorb setbacks and recalculate. But the agreements were suspended. The ranchers could not be bound by documents that were under active review. Ruth Alderman's water rights were, for the moment, hers. Joel Marsh's 4-year dispute was open for proper adjudication. The ground had shifted, and shifting ground meant that the people who'd been living at the mercy of a manufactured system were no longer quite as trapped inside it. That was real. That was not nothing. Haynes shook Naomi's hand outside the building afterward, in the afternoon light. "I'll be in contact as the investigation proceeds," he said. "There will be more they need from you and the others." "I'll be there," she said. "I know." He looked at her with what she thought might be the closest he got to admiration, kept carefully professional. "You kept your head through this. That's rarer than you might think." She thanked him, and he left to find his horse, and she stood on the courthouse steps for a moment with Ruth on one side and Joel on the other, and Opal Gentry coming out the door behind them, and she looked at the sky, which was doing nothing more significant than being a sky on a Thursday afternoon, cloudless and ordinary and indifferent. "Well," Joel said. "Well," Ruth agreed. Opal came down the steps and stood beside Naomi and looked at the sky with her. "Thomas would have come down here himself," Opal said. "He hated making the trip, but he would have done it." "Tell me about him sometime," Naomi said, "when we have a slower day." Opal glanced at her sideways. "We'll have to wait for a slow day to come around then. I'm not sure I've seen one lately." The ride back toward Dustfall Ridge took most of the afternoon and the early evening. Silas rode alongside her for the first stretch without talking, which had become a comfortable thing. The silence between them had changed its quality over the past weeks from something careful to something settled, the difference between two people managing their proximity and two people simply being in the same space. When the town came into view in the last of the evening light, sitting low in its valley with the red dust settling and the lamps coming on in the windows along Mercer Street, Naomi felt something she hadn't expected to feel, a kind of recognition, as if the place were acknowledging her, which she knew was not how places worked, but which was how it felt. She had not been born here. She had not chosen it with any particular conviction. She had arrived when she needed somewhere to be and it had been available, and she had stayed because leaving had felt like letting something win that she wasn't willing to let win. And in the 3 years of staying, she had built something, a business, a reputation, a set of relationships with people who had shown up when she asked, and in some cases before she asked. That was hers in a way that had nothing to do with anyone giving it to her. That mattered. She wanted to let herself know it mattered. "You're quiet," Silas said. "I'm thinking." "About the ruling?" "About staying," she said. "About what it means to stay somewhere long enough that it becomes yours." He was quiet for a moment. "Did you ever think about leaving during the 3 years?" "Twice. Both times I decided not to." She looked at the town ahead. "I didn't stay because I was waiting for you, whatever people said. I stayed because I had something here I wasn't willing to walk away from." She paused. "You being gone was a pain I carried. It wasn't a reason." "I know," he said. "I know that now. Do you understand why I need you to know it?" He thought about it seriously, which she appreciated. He didn't give her an immediate answer. "Because if I thought you'd stayed for me," he said slowly, "I'd always wonder whether you'd chosen me or whether you'd just stayed in the same place I eventually came back to." He looked at her. "And that's not the same thing." "No," she said. "It's not." "You chose the life," he said, "and now you're choosing what's in it." She looked at him, at the face that was older than it had been 3 years ago, that carried something different now than the particular restless energy she'd known in the man who'd ridden out. He was not that man anymore. She was not the woman he'd left. Whatever they were building it as the people they had become, not the people they'd been, which was harder in some ways and better in others. "I'm choosing," she said. "I'm still working out exactly what." He nodded. "I can live with that." "You'll have to." The corner of his mouth moved. "Yeah, I'll manage." They rode into town as the last of the light left the sky, and on Mercer Street the lamps were lit and a few people were still out, the ordinary evening business of a place going about its life. Outside the laundry building, Agnes was sitting on the step waiting, because Agnes had not been able to come to the hearing and had been sitting on the step for the last hour, according to the expression on her face when she saw them. She stood up. "Well?" she said. "Hold stands," Naomi said, coming down from the horse. "Agreement suspended pending review." Agnes pressed her lips together hard. She nodded once. Then she turned and went inside without another word, which was how Agnes handled things that were larger than she wanted to handle in public. Naomi followed her in. The laundry was clean and quiet, the washboards empty, the lines bare for the night. Agnes was at the back of the room, standing with her back to the door and her arms crossed, and when Naomi came in, she didn't turn around right away. 11 years, Agnes said. The same thing she'd said the morning Silas came back with the injunction news. He worked 11 years for that man. I know. He deserved to see this. He does. And you're seeing it for him. Naomi came and stood beside her. Not touching, not hovering, just beside. That's not nothing, Agnes. Agnes uncrossed her arms. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, which she would not have done if she'd thought anyone was looking too closely. No, she said. It's not nothing. They stood together in the empty laundry for a while. Then Agnes straightened up and looked around the room. I'll need to get the morning loads ready, she said. Tomorrow, Naomi said. Tonight you go home. Agnes looked at her. Then she took her coat from the hook and put it on and went home. Naomi sat alone in the laundry for a while after, in the particular quiet of a place that has been the center of something and is resting now. She thought about what Haynes had said, you kept your head, and about what Opal had said. Old women know things, we've just learned to keep quiet because nobody asked, and about what Ruth had written in her statement with her careful dates and her precise memory of every blocked channel, every declined offer. Every morning she'd woken up alone on a property she was fighting to keep. She thought about what it meant that all of that knowledge had existed, scattered through the county in people's memories and desk drawers and oilcloth boxes, waiting to be connected. That the system Frank Doyle had built depended entirely on that knowledge staying scattered. That the moment it was organized, not by someone with legal authority or financial power or any particular credential, but by a woman with a list and a willingness to ask questions and listen to the answers, the whole structure began to show its seams. That was the thing she was going to carry forward from this. Not the injunction, though that mattered. Not the hearing, though that mattered too. The thing she was going to carry was the understanding that isolation was a choice that could be reversed, that the walls people lived inside were usually thinner than they looked from the inside, that the act of asking someone a question and believing the answer they gave you was more powerful than it seemed, because it told the person that their experience was real and worth accounting for, and that changed what they were willing to do. She was not going to pretend this was finished. It wasn't. The investigation would take months. The appeal would be filed and argued. Doyle would find his angles and his people would find their pressures, and there would be more days like the day she'd burned the washing and the days at 3 in the morning when the thinking ran in circles. She was not naive about what lay ahead, but something had ended tonight too. Something that had started 3 years ago when a man rode out of town and she had stood in the road and watched him go and made the choice, not the comfortable choice, not the sensible one, but the choice that was truest to what she knew about herself. To stay. She had stayed, and she had built. And the building had turned out to be larger than she'd planned for, because you couldn't always see in advance what you were laying the foundation for. She heard footsteps on the porch, a knock on the open door, which was unnecessary since she'd left it open, but was the kind of thing Silas did now. Not walking in without announcement, not assuming. Learning the small courtesies of someone who wanted to be in a life and understood you had to earn the right to be easy in it. "Come in," she said. He came in. He looked at the empty laundry and then at her sitting in the chair, and he pulled up the other chair without asking and sat down, his elbows on his knees. They sat for a moment in the kind of quiet that meant neither of them needed to fill it. Then he said, "Are you all right?" "I'm tired," she said. "And I'm all right. Both things." "Yeah." He understood that. Both things at once is usually where you end up after something like this. Is that how you felt? After things on the road that mattered? He thought about it. After the things that mattered, yeah. The things that didn't matter just made me tired. He looked at her. "This made you tired in the right way." She almost smiled at that. "In the right way." The lamp between them made the room warm and the shadows soft. And outside Mercer Street had settled into its nighttime quiet, and somewhere down the road someone had a fire going, the smell of it coming in through the open door on the evening air. "Silas," she said. "Yeah." "You asked me once if I was still waiting." He looked at her carefully. "I asked if you were still waiting when I rode in. You said only for me." "I was being kind," she said. "Or maybe I was testing something. I'm not sure anymore." She held his eyes. "I wasn't waiting. I want you to know that. I was living. And what I felt when you rode back in had nothing to do with waiting ending. It had to do with someone arriving who I hadn't been able to stop mattering to, even when I'd tried." He was very still. "That's the truth," she said. "I thought you should have it." "I don't know what I did to deserve it," he said quietly. "You came back," she said. "And then you stayed. And it turns out that's not a small thing. It turns out that's the main thing." She let out a slow breath. "I've been watching you these past weeks. Not the big gestures, the small ones, the hinge, the wood, the conversations with people I needed you to have on my behalf. The way you rode 40 miles and came back in 3 days instead of 4, because you knew I was waiting for news." She paused. "You were different, and I kept waiting for it to slip. For the real version of you to come out and be the one who left." "And? It didn't slip." She looked at him. "I'm not saying I'm certain about everything. I'm saying I'm certain about enough." He reached across the space between their chairs and set his hand on the table between them, palm up. Not a reach toward her. Just a hand, offered, patient. She looked at it for a moment. Then she set her hand in his. It was not a grand moment. The lamp flickered slightly in a draft. Outside, a horse moved somewhere on the street. Her hand in his was warm and a little rough on both sides. Two people who worked with their hands for a living, which was not a romantic detail but was a real one, and real was what she'd wanted. "I'm not waiting anymore," she said. "No," he agreed. "I'm walking," she said. "Just figuring out the direction." "We can figure that out," he said. "Together, if that's what you want." She thought about what together meant for two people who were both better alone than most, who both had the particular independence of people who'd learned the hard way that needing someone was a vulnerability until you chose someone worth the vulnerability. She thought about how that didn't have to mean merging everything, how it could mean walking in the same direction and choosing to match pace. "That's what I want," she said. His hand closed around hers. Not tight, just present. They sat that way for a while, in the laundry that smelled of soap and water and work, in the town they had both chosen to stay in, with the night outside and the investigation ongoing and all of the uncertain future still ahead of them, not resolved but moving, the way the future always is when you're willing to walk into it. Nobody told Naomi Carter that what she built in those 2 weeks would last. Nobody promised her that the hearing would go the way she hoped, or that the appeal would fail, or that Frank Doyle would ultimately face consequences that matched his actions. Because the world didn't always organize itself that way, and she'd lived long enough to know it. Nobody guaranteed her that the thing growing between her and Silas would hold, or that the people she'd pulled together would stay together once the pressure eased, or that the isolation would never creep back into this small valley town. What she knew, what she would carry forward, and what the weeks had taught her in the way that experience teaches things that advice never quite can, was this. You don't wait to be certain before you start. You start with what you have. A list, a question, a willingness to knock on a door and believe the person who opens it. You don't wait for someone to build you a platform before you speak. You speak from where you're standing, in the room you're in, with the 11 pages you've put together from borrowed time and burned midnight oil. And you don't wait for love to arrive fully formed and ask nothing of you. You recognize it in the hinge someone fixed without being asked, in the 3 days instead of 4, in the hand that sits open on the table and lets you decide. The longest wait is never for the thing to come to you. It's for you to decide you're worth walking toward it. Naomi Carter had decided. She was walking.